So the next panel is about how to encourage innovative and useful research in today's era of scarce finances, competing incentives, and new media. And we're privileged to have with us one of the giants of new media, Tyler Cowen, who is professor of economics at George Mason University and director of the Mercatus Center. I was interested in his bio that Bloomberg Businessweek dubbed him America's hottest economist. So ladies, try to control yourselves. And of course, we all know Tyler from his blog, which is a must-read for all of us, www.marginalrevolution.com. And so let me turn the floor over to Tyler, who will chair this session.
Thank you all for coming. This session is going to confront some very important issues. The world we all live in has been changing rapidly. On one hand, higher education is much more financially pinched moving forward. Not every school, but we're seeing some schools starting to close. We're seeing state aid to schools in the United States going down. And at the same time, a new means of reaching economists and the public has arisen for economics, and that's social media, most prominently blogs, but not just blogs, websites, working paper networks, Twitter, many other micromedia within social media more generally. So we face an issue when higher education is changing and social media appear to be more important. What will we do to maintain standards of innovation and creativity and relevance for economics? At the same time, what will we do to maintain standards of quality? How will we keep the benefits of peer review while perhaps avoiding or minimizing some of the costs of over-specialization? That's just a very broad brush overview of the topics we'll be dealing with. Of course, each presenter will have the freedom to address what he or she sees fit. We're going to start with Kenneth Arrow. In general, I'm not going to introduce the panelists who are well known. Ken is the world's greatest economist. I feel I at least ought to introduce him with that. But we'll all start with about 5 minutes apiece, and then we'll have back and forth, and then we'll have questions. Ken.
Well, let me, obviously the topic is an enormous one, and the question of the economics of higher education and the idea of technological improvement, possibly, and in terms of online courses, presentation methods, and the like, is relevant. I've never really seen, by the way, a good analysis of why university education is so expensive. I engaged in 2 activities in my lifetime. I've been a student, and I've shaved. Shaving is cheaper today, I think, even in nominal terms. If you take blades when you take, the number of times I have to replace the blade, it used to be essentially two shaves and you're through. Now, I don't know, it seems to go on forever. And I suspect even in nominal terms, shaving is cheaper. The tuition when I went to graduate school I went to a free college, by the way. That probably no longer exists anywhere. The tuition was $0. This is City College of New York. And it was a good institution. We had good teachers. I mean, they vary as they would in any institution I know of, and there were many very, very good teachers. The student quality was high, and it was a very successful education. The tuition was $0. Graduate school, which was a regular paying Columbia University, class, $400. Was it $45,000 today? Now, it's gone up by 100 to 1. I don't think of any serious, I can't think offhand of any commodity that has gone up to that extent. So this is and this is, of course, part of the reason for the squeeze on the public universities that you mentioned, plus, of course, competing demands like prisons for the funds, and prisons and medical care, I guess, are the 2 big items, the 2 items that have grown. All right. Let me, however, concentrate on, just for a few minutes on the one interesting point, and that's it's a typical good and bad. How do you keep up with literature? When I started my career there were essentially 8 journals in economics, English and American, which counted. And they were, each of them was a third or a half the size. These journals still exist for the most part: Economic Journal, American Economic Review, Econometrica. But a single issue is maybe 3 times the size that it was then. But now there are lots of excellent articles that one should keep up with in maybe 40 journals, not 8. And the corresponding flood of papers. Now this, you see, this reflects a good in a way. The volume of good research is staggeringly greater than it was. This leads, of course, into problem: how do you keep up with it? It was really possible. Economics is a peculiarly unified field compared to a lot of others. An economist generally has some idea what's going on, and it can sort of understand in a general way what's going on in other fields, in fields other than the ones he or she is specializing in. It's not true. Mathematicians, an algebraist will tell you that doesn't understand what's going on in partial differential equations. And historians, of course, even more extreme. So to keep up in a general way, we now have the problem: how do you possibly keep up? The abstract, for example, is a much more important matter than it used to be. I would hardly bother with abstracts when I read a paper when I started as graduate student. Now, I'm lucky if I can get through a reasonable number of them, and even in fields which I'm trying to follow. So we have a very interesting communication problem. We want to keep, as Professor Cowen said, the quality control. The one thing we still rely on journals for is quality control. It's the refereeing process. First place, this is getting pretty taxing since there are an awful lot of papers to referee. Rejection rates in a journal like the American Economic Review are something the order of 80%. So it imposes a strain on getting the problems into publication. And I don't know, I'm really trying to, I'm not going to pose any real answers. I'm just going to say this problem of communication seems to be a basic one, and that has to be faced. Thank you.
Lee?
Yes. About 2 years ago, we had a one-day conference in Beijing, which was looking at the question of the nature of incentives in Chinese universities at that time. I mention that because we didn't come to any strong conclusions there, but what struck me was that has been really very little application of the Coase arguments of economics in general to the incentive issue and structures within education. I guess my main message I would like to convey here is I think there's a very good research possibilities for people here and people in our network to try to dig into these issues and understand how it plays out. In the Coase, we have alumni from 69 countries. The Coase Institute is primarily focused on developing countries there. And the university system in most of those countries is not really very good or very supportive of research careers and research possibilities. So the comments originally here about the changing technology, we have a medieval institution that in some ways hasn't changed for the last 1,000 years with regard to lectures and so forth there. That's going to change. The financing is going to change. And I think we need to study it more carefully. Now, there's a related issue with regard to research. We're in the Coase Institute, the real issue is to get people to study these problems. You need to spend time. It takes time to understand the institutional details. You need people whose career is committed in a way that they can actually become experts there. What is the financial mechanism? What is the business model that is going to make that possible? What are the career tracks that permit people to do this? And in some countries, I've talked to some of you here, Chile comes to mind here. Chile has a large number of small research units like Brookings, but much smaller, which do provide career possibilities and provide essentially the infrastructure for these research possibilities here. I mean, our business is trying to help people's careers to do good research on institutional issues. And I don't have a simple, easy answer here, but I do think there is a major opportunity to do this. I think the concrete implications of this is for you all here. You have to be entrepreneurs in terms of your career. The notion that you're going to go out and get a comfortable position with a tenure track and all that sort of thing, it happens, but it's decreasingly the case. So I wish I had more specific, concrete paths through which I think we can go here. Things are going to change, and I just hope that we're sufficiently creative with regard to the business models, the kind of NGOs, the government research centers, and so forth, that we can continue the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary?
Yeah, well, I actually do not have any useful comments, really, about the university structure or the support for research. But I do have an idea about a research area that's really in a Coasean tradition that is an example of the kinds of things I think we ought to do in a more precise way. And so this has to do with, not surprisingly, environmental regulation, but cap and trade. Because economists, frankly, have been, at least in environmental economists, have been quite delighted with the notion that we can move away from standard regulation, put a cap on emissions or fishing or amount of habitat that we're going to degrade or that we want to keep, and then issue shares in that. And then announce that this is a Coasean system because these things are tradable and they're a kind of a pseudo property right, and life is good. And the problem with that is life is not good, because these, in the United States in particular, surprisingly, these are not a property right. They are a use right that can be revoked at any time without compensation. Now, I think Coase would have been right on that issue, but most economists haven't been. And so what does that mean? It means that timelines are very short. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so how would we see this empirically? Well, what we see are these emission allowances, trading prices, and fishery ITQs, individual transferable quota prices, are extremely volatile. And moreover, they are low, okay? For example, there is not a single emission trading scheme where the price of the emission permit is anywhere close to what many believe to be the social cost of carbon. And so why is that? And my hypothesis is that it's because these are very insecure property rights. Now, it isn't just an idle hypothesis. We actually have some more empirical evidence out there. But again, economists have not picked up, I think, on the real reason for it. And that is we had a very successful sulfur dioxide trading scheme, a national one. And that was the poster child for the Kyoto Protocol's greenhouse gas emission trading scheme that was suggested. That has totally disappeared. The SO2 trading scheme has totally disappeared. And now, why is that? Well, the EPA, which is the agency monitoring this, had a variety of mandates that it had to meet, and those mandates were not consistent with maintaining a national trading scheme. And so as a consequence, they essentially undermined, in order to meet other mandates, undermined the national trading scheme, and the value of the SO2 trading allocations dropped to zero, stranding between $2 and $3 billion of bank permits. Okay? If the agency would have had to pay permit holders for the value of these allocations, they might have had to search for a variety of different ways to meet these other mandates. But it didn't have to, so it didn't have to consider that opportunity cost. So what does this all mean? It means that the details of the institutions that we are wanting to explore or prescribe in the Coasean tradition are incredibly important, and they really get to the heart of whether or not an institution actually is going to function in the way that we suggest or not. So this is an area that I think deserves more attention, and you all are equipped to do that.
Claude?
Thank you to give me the opportunity to intervene here on this very difficult issue of how to encourage innovation and useful research. So let me make very shortly a few points. First, I think that the basic outline is it's in your hands. Yours being mostly the young researchers and PhD scholars. You have to find your way in the jungle of different ideas. In my view, the scarce finances is not the major issue. Think about how much Coase did with very, very little financial resources, digging into the archives of the BBC, the Postal Service, and so on, the FCC, to elaborate ideas. And I think Ken didn't have a huge budget to do his research either. So I think that it's really the content that matters. That's my first point. So the question for me is rather, what problems can motivate your research, and how relevant are these problems? The first question is relatively easy. You know, what problems can motivate your research? It depends on your motivation, and is something that you elaborate in the interaction with your friends and with your teachers and so forth. The second question, how relevant are these problems, is of course much more difficult, and there's clearly no straightforward answer to that. My view is that to try to catch if it's relevant or not, the main strategy is to diversify your exposure. Attend workshops, try to interact with people who are raising questions that are not the standard one that you find in all textbooks and all that. Try to find puzzling questions. And if you find puzzling questions, then you have to be a risk taker, entrepreneurial, as Lee said. So that's my second point. The third one is more about the content, properly speaking, like something like what Gary suggested, although from a different point of view because my interest is different. My main message is, okay, for example, over the last 2 days, mostly yesterday, but also this morning, we got a lot of presentation about the big picture, the institutions that matter and so forth, which is, of course, very, very important. At the same time, it's very difficult. If you compare the institutions of China with the institutions of India, or even some specific institution in that context, like Colin did this morning, it's very important but very difficult. And I think that there's an advantage of also being more involved in the microanalytic approach. And again, think about what Coase did. He started working on the BBC, the FCC, and it is based on these microanalytical approach that he developed his basic ideas that you find in the problem of social cost, or even in the nature of the firm, where he started working with, what's the relationship between GM and Fisher Buddy and so forth. So I think that being more microanalytics give you tools to understand better the interaction between the general institutions, the law, or the intermediary institution, local authorities, and so forth, and how the system works. And then it gives you a way to enter into the analysis of institutions, rather than remaining at a very general level. So of course, my focus is mostly on economics of infrastructure, but I think that in that respect, and it's like for the environmental issue, there's a lot to do in that perspective, Looking at the interaction between technology and technological change on one hand, and changes in the regulatory mechanisms on the other hand. There's a very challenging issue for almost all aspects of network infrastructure, from water to electricity to the telecom. The second aspect is what is, to be more analytic about what is the, and this is very much from a transaction cost perspective, mixing Williamson and Coase in a certain respect. What is the interaction between these different mechanisms, these different institutional devices, going as low as the local authorities, as has been mentioned for China this morning, and how they interact with the network infrastructures. What's the impact on the way the delivering of these infrastructure is organized? So I think that we need to be more micro-analytic from a Coasian perspective. For me, that's a very central message from Coase. So make sure that you have a good base camp, meaning, you know, solid institutional background. You need that to work. You don't need that much money, but you need an institutional base camp. Also, from a theoretical point of view, theoretical tools that you master well, and then go out of the beaten track.
Thank you. Sam.
I'm going to depart from the beaten track by speaking from the podium. I'm going to spend all my 5 minutes on matters that I raised in my talk yesterday, specifically the journal evaluation and editing process. I know it firsthand. That's one reason for doing it. And I also, as I hinted yesterday, it's the weak link in this process of producing and distributing academic knowledge. And I'll conclude with a radical suggestion for support of academic research. Why do I call it the weak link? Well, the facts are pretty clear. And Ken alluded to them in his talk. It takes, as best we can measure this, at least twice as long as it used to. Used to being, say, circa 1970 or thereabouts. It ends up publishing work that is twice as long and growing. And every effort, there have been some efforts to rein that in, have failed. And as best we can tell, the extra time and words don't lead proportionately to more knowledge, at least per article. Now, why has this occurred? Again, you've heard a lot of the reasons, and I'm not going to go over them. The field is more specialized, it's more technical, it's less accessible to a wide audience. I would add, as an editor, the typical manuscript you get is now co-authored, and it's clear that the parts are farmed out. So you have one person's doing the theory, another one's doing the empirical work, and it's more specialized even within an article. But a good part of the problem lies with this editing process. Right? And one part of the problem, I alluded to this yesterday, it's relying mostly on volunteer labor, a lot of demands on their time other than editing. And for a good reviewer, the rewards are mostly extrinsic. And there are some results that I mentioned yesterday, that less time and attention is paid, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I find the process is critical to developing the talent, especially for empirical work in the Coasean tradition. Young authors often need to learn how to do this kind of work, and their only practical chance, really, of learning is in this review process. Careful editing and reviewing is crucial. So now I come to funding academic research, where I want to suggest that we might want to go in a different direction. The traditional direction has been to subsidize the inputs and hope for a good outcome. And I want to suggest this model is broken. If it's not broken, it's very frayed around the edges. The people who provide the funding are less likely to know who the good horses are today because of all the developments I've been talking about. They're less able to evaluate the output themselves, so they're relying on us, the editors and the reviewers, to shape the output, and we're devoting less time to the job, certainly per manuscript that we get. I mean, what Ken talked about is absolutely true. The proliferation of journals and manuscripts is kind of overwhelming. So here's my radical suggestion. We shift the funding from the inputs to awarding prizes for the output. Okay, and I should say we should load this funding on top of everything else, but I understand, I'm old, I understand about scarcity, and you can't just say we should have more. If I had my druthers, I would shift some funding from subsidizing inputs to output. And I don't have a precise blueprint for how this should be done. Somebody just said, the devil is in the details, and I don't have details. But the broad outline of where I'm going, I think, is clear. Suppose you're interested in encouraging research on the evolution of property rights. You should, instead of subsidizing some promising scholar in that field, at least partly, I'm not saying you should go to another corner in this in any sense, but shift some funds into announcing a prize for the best academic article on property rights in 2015. Then find some like-minded academic folks to evaluate such papers. It could, in fact, be an organization like the Coase Institute or something else. It could be a journal, even. But you're going to have to make it worth their time to evaluate seriously the articles on property rights in 2015. So you're going to have to cut in these folks on the prize. You might even cut in the reviewers. And you're going to make it obviously worth the researcher's effort to compete seriously. The total cost of this, again, I don't know the details, would be on the order of 1 or 2 academic projects in the traditional model. So that's my suggestion, and I'll stop with it and just urge you to think about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. As moderator, I'll go last. I'm fairly optimistic that economics research will remain relevant and probably become more relevant. Let me first cite a few economic reasons why I think that's the case. The first is selection. So the more quantitative economics becomes, the more likely it is that young people now who are becoming top economists, they had the option of going into finance. And we all know that finance on average pays much more money. So if we think back to Ronald Coase, you don't think of Coase as someone where, had he not become Ronald Coase, he would have been a banker. But when the next best option is finance, in essence, you're selecting for people at the very top who want to carry some kind of message to a broader public. And people who are just careerists, they will basically go into finance. So I think over time, the scholars we'll see at our top 6 or top 10 or top whatever universities, they will be more interested in carrying a message to a broader audience, in part because economics itself is not justifying in pecuniary terms only becoming an economist. In some ways, this is healthy. If we then think of schools a bit further down on the pecking order, here's what I see them doing. I see them as having a non-functional business model. They have, like Chinese provinces, a very high degree of implicit leverage. They've made commitments they can't keep, and their quote-unquote solution to that is to raise tuition 5 to 7% every year. But they can't keep on doing that because the wage growth is not there, the state aid is not there to support that decision. So what schools lower down are doing is they're improving their fundraising, they're improving their marketing, and what they like to do is take their top 10 or 20 faculty and just market the hell out of those people and try to raise money against them. And I find that at lesser schools outside the top 10 or 20, the, say, 20, 30, 40, however many faculty members who are working on something relevant, bringing in a lot of money, contracts, grants, fundraising, whatever, they have much more sway. I'm finding that department heads have less influence, and overall administrators are gaining in influence. And administrators, on the whole, tend to like faculty members who are well-known, who can be marketed, who can be shown off to donors, and that means faculty members who are doing something relevant. So I think what we'll see in schools ranked, say, maybe 20 through 70 over the next 10, 20 years is less attention or less priority paid to specialized research, more attention paid to potential stars, sometimes at the expense of quality even, and the idea of producing small pieces of research at a school ranked, say, number 64 on the economics list. I think that's really going away rapidly, and to some extent that slack is being taken up by people doing work abroad. I think another significant economic change in higher education in economics is just how many graduate students come from other countries. So if you look at the steady state and you see through retirements, I think in the steady state, the top 20, 30 departments will probably be 3/4 foreign-born or foreign-educated at the undergraduate level. And we already see this is the case. You look at a list of graduating students from somewhere like Chicago, you can't always tell just by looking at the names, but it seems to me about 80% foreign, some years even more. So I think looking forward, this will have a big impact. I think it will continue to be a comparative advantage for what I would call Anglo-American students, that the Anglo-American students and eventually professors, they will be the public intellectuals. So if you look at who are the people who are public intellectuals in economics today, Amartya Sen would be a big exception, but for the most part, Anglo-Americans are disproportionately represented. The economists who are read the most often, most influential, have the largest public audiences. To me, it's striking how much those individuals still are Anglo-American compared, say, to citations or getting tenure at the top schools. And some of that may be linguistic fluency, but I don't actually think that's the main factor anymore. I think there's something in the notion of growing up in a society with nearly full free speech, the liberal arts education that is so common in the United States and also in England, that tends to lead the Anglo-Americans into being the public intellectuals. And I think that's the future of our discipline. I think we're very radically, very quickly in a new world where people who write free online, they have much, much more influence than other economists. On a given day, there are 2 or 3 million people reading blogs. Top blogs on a good day can have 100 to 200,000 people reading them. If Krugman's blog link is on the front page of the New York Times, in his case, even more. If you were to just tally up who are the most widely read economists of today, probably 3/4 of the top 15 would be people who write for free online, whether it be blogs or some other medium. If I think of myself, I'm at a school rated about number 50, but actually in reality, I'm probably one of the most widely read economists ever. And that's strange. We're not used to that world. What shapes, who shapes what gets read, published in refereed journals? It's people who write for free online, open access. If you look at Tommy Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, the debates over that were processed within 2 weeks, online, open access, and mostly not in journals. It will someday come out in journals, but everything now happens much more quickly. A lot of people who are amateurs have contributions. This is a big spur to make economics more relevant, I think. It will encourage some people, not all, but overall, I think actually there's a pretty big argument for being optimistic about relevance in the future of economic science. At this point, I'll just open up to the panel. Anyone who would like to address any comments brought up by the others? Any takers?
Let me make a remark. The this probably befits my age, and namely, things weren't so bad in the past. I'm not saying the past was a golden age, if it wasn't. But the university, well, let me start by a general statement, which I think would be, which is maybe more Burkean than Coasean, although it probably fits in with Coase's views too. The importance of, in scholarship, for the moment, let me take scholarship. I want to come to teaching in a minute. Well, in both scholarship and teaching, let me put it this way. The importance of motivation, intrinsic motivation, of motivation in a social context, to be a good teacher. In many cases, good teaching doesn't pay off for reasons that you've stressed on the, in terms of academic career, salary, using economic incentives. But the fact is that, to this day, even the most research-minded professor, at least in economics, has some concern about teaching, and that also plays a role in the appointment process. There certainly are limits to what you can do. There are people who do fine research and are incapable of teaching. We've all experienced that. And they are marginalized, they're put in special niches or something like that. That means they can do their research. But for the most part, there is felt a responsibility on people who are probably not necessarily natural teachers, feeling, nevertheless, that they, even though scholars, that their reputation, the university's reputation, depends on their scholars, still feel the need for teaching as a thing. In a similar way, scholarship itself is devoted to a large extent to improving the state of the art. We have far more product today. We have all the problems of editing, of dealing with this flood. But the fact is, most of it is because it's better. We are so one thing is, of course, that the cost of access to data is much lower today than it was. And that has reflected itself in studies such as we've heard reported on in some of these sessions here, and of course in any sessions where policies both of great moment and of great intellectual interest, which are not necessarily the same thing in economics or in any other field, we can do specific statements of a kind that Coase would emphasize, because it's easier to get the data, and it's being produced more. Of course, that has its own problems, leads to an uncritical attitude toward the sources of data. But every good thing is marked by creating new problems. So that's not necessarily bad. So I think the importance of and this goes back to the nature of the university. The university has been, the Middle Ages are sometimes looked down upon, especially ever since the Renaissance, but they created an institution which is absolutely one of the most important things in the whole world that has ever been done. And my God, the original. When I was just beginning my career at Chicago, I had this eccentric, although charismatic, president, Robert Hutchins. So this name may not mean much to many of you. But I remember giving a talk to the faculty. Why do you lecture? Lecturing, he says, was a technological device by which, in a day when writing was very scarce, somebody could read, and then other students would take it down. This is a way in which you multiplied manuscripts. I don't think that is, in fact, a historically accurate statement, but let's leave that aside. I said, why don't you, if you have things to say, write them out and mimeograph them. I don't know how any of you know what mimeographing is, but it's a method of reproduction, a quick method of reproduction. And give them to the students. Well, the faculty listened to this. I don't believe any faculty member changed his methods at all under the influence of Hutchins' eloquence. And the same way, we have a continuous emphasis, technological changes, but I'm afraid that so far, nothing has really quite replaced I don't think MOOCs have really replaced. I mean, you got 100,000 people sign up and 5,000 complete the course or something like that. I don't know whether you regard this as a success or not. It's true it's cheap, dropping out. I'd like to know what is retained. And for certain purposes, there's certain kinds of learning where this is probably useful, but I do not think it's a substitute so far for what the university does. So I'm being a reactionary here, and conservative, what I like to maybe conservative. As I say, it's more like Burke, maybe, than anybody else. But I think the fact is there is this idea of research and the importance simply of the reviewers and the peer review system, which we haven't come to. There may be a better one, but I haven't seen it yet. And we need the certification. When the world is so complicated, you have to have some screening device, and this does as well as anything. So I really feel that one must proceed with great caution in changing, in any sort of radical way of changing either the teaching phenomenon or the teaching burden, the teaching task, and the research task. That the institutions that we've had for a long while and greatly improved in the 20th century, I would say, really are not yet ready to be replaced. It's easy to see what the criticisms of them, the volume, the problem of quality control, but I have not seen any superior alternative so far.
Who else would like to jump in on this?
Well, I just had listening to both Tyler and Sam, it does seem like there's a tension here between the idea of getting things out quickly and the pressure to get things out quickly through blogs and other means, and quality control that is much slower and going through the peer review process within academic journals. And I'm not quite sure how that tension will play out. I mean, you could take things from a journal and put it into a blog, but then a lot of time has passed. And so I'm not sure that is the mechanism how this will work. But I think a lot of stuff that's not proven and not that carefully done could get out in a hurry and sort of set the discussion and the debate, and it can be wrong. Whereas at least the refereeing process and the peer review process attempts to put some standards and quality controls on this process. So I think there's an issue here, and I don't have an answer to it. But
Yes.
I may react a bit to something you said, Tyler, which is about the Anglo-American domination in the field of economics, which is surely true as for today.
No, I meant public intellectuals who are economists.
But,
it's not all of economics.
I'm of Canadian origin. I've been trained in Canada, and I benefited from that domination in a sense. All my professors have been trained in American university and so forth. But I think that it is true as for now, but it's changing. There are excellent universities developing elsewhere, and in 15 years from now, in 20 years from now, I'm not so sure that it will be the same situation. For example, the universities that I know, for example, National University of Singapore or Fudan in China, these are excellent universities. Now, the point is, if these universities are developing and training people, and I think we have to be aware of that, there may be also different approaches that will develop because they're confronting different problems. So there will be an interaction between the problems they are dealing with and the conceptual framework. And I think it's important to be aware of that, to be open to these possibilities. So
I'll just say a few remarks on how I see quality certification working today. If I think back to the 1980s, by far the most important journal was the Journal of Political Economy. Nothing else came close. You would wait with bated breath for every issue. Issues had papers which would change how you view the world. Today, the most important journal, if you would call it that, is the National Bureau of Economic Research Working Paper Series. That's what everyone waits for. And I think Gary raises a good point. There may be papers in that series which are not quite ready to be there or not meeting the standards of what used to be published, or still the standards of the Journal for Political Economy. But I think here's how quality certification works. Something from the NBER working paper series gets put out on the internet, be it blogs or other places. And then within 6 hours, you have actually several hundred people with varying degrees of expertise, but most of them economists, reading it. And they leave feedback on the internet. And that feedback is in some way aggregated, and that debate is held typically within a span of about 48 hours. So maybe none of those 200 or 300 people are reading it with the care that the 3 referees would, but there's a very rapid back and forth. There's an openness to what is being said. There's an ability to parry and respond, which happens pretty quickly. I think that has some strengths and that has some weaknesses. But it's not the case that in what you might call internet economics, there aren't any checks. The checks are pretty severe. And if you ever want to test them, just try putting up a mistake on the internet. You find out about it typically within 30 seconds or a minute at the most. Now, what's a mistake and what's a deeper way of seeing a mistake that a referee has that an economist reading something online does not have? That's still a very important point. But I don't think that the new way of judging quality is necessarily worse. And if you ask a simple question, what do people at the Fed look at? What do people who work for the president and the CEA look at? It's really internet economics that shapes what they talk about. What does President Obama read? President Obama reads blogs. He probably doesn't read the American Economic Review or the JPE.
No, previous president either.
So this new world has come very quickly, and I think it's symbiotic and complementary to the world of journals. And the question is, what can we do to improve it?
Tyler, I have a question for you. Is anyone making money on these online courses now, or is this directly there? What's the status of the business model on it?
The question is about online courses. Is anyone making money? First, if you look at corporate online courses, which are not the ones you read about in the newspapers, those are making a lot of money, and they're used by large corporations, and that's entirely viable and more or less internalized. What you all are calling MOOCs, none of those have made money. I think they're not designed to make money, and my guess is in their current form they'll never make money. What is making money, or at least on the verge of making money, is there's a small number of schools, actually often state schools. Georgia Tech and Arizona State are probably the 2 leading examples, and they have gated classes which are online. They're not MOOCs. And I'm not sure those are making money today, but those, I think it appears very strongly, they're on the verge of making money. And my vision of the future of online education is that it becomes 10 or 15% of our sector. I agree very much with Ken's remarks about how many parts of the old system are valuable and will never go away. But if you just add up people in the military, people who have jobs, people who are watching children, people who are disabled, people who live in other countries, and people who don't want to get up Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 8 a.m., plus those who maybe want to take history of economic thought and it's not given at their college or university, add all that up and move that online, which I think is entirely feasible. 10 to 15% of the higher education sector is a big deal. And that shift of revenue to fairly centralized sources of supply, I think, will be one factor putting under a lot of lesser schools. But there may be other opinions on this here. Sam, do you want to weigh in on any of this?
Well, no, I'd rather leave it up to them to ask questions.
Well, let's open to questions now. We've had some back and forth. Yes, in the audience.
I have a lot of disagreements with what you said, but I'd like to...
Well, is this working? Yeah. I have the privilege of having the mic in my hand, so I'm going to use that. My concern that I'd like the panel to talk about is the fact that the certification process, particularly publication in prestigious mainstream journals, has now spread to developing countries, to the point where I was invited by the African Economic Research Council to one of their meetings, and there were 2 Nigerians publishing a very sophisticated econometric analysis of the Lagos stock market that never once mentioned the term insider trading or the size of the market being very small. It was a striking waste of human capital, I thought. And we know now that in Chinese universities, publication in American journals earns you a bonus that is prorated depending on how prestigious the journal is, so that if you get into the AER, you get $50,000. So to what extent does the future hold for young people? I mean, if we think that the mainstream journals are discouraging people from doing the kind of research that Ronald Coase did, research on institutions, are we somehow distorting the kind of intellectual capital that will evolve in these countries, the kind of teachers they will have, and the kind of research that will be done there? And maybe what we need is some sort of prize system or more rewards for people who publish in blogs and other internet media.
Well, I could say a little about that. I think that the journal business is becoming more globalized, but very, very slowly. You now have respectable journals outside of the United States. That's outside of the Anglo-American sphere, which used to be almost it. I mean, if you think back, there were foreign language journals. They're all doing English now. And you're getting a spread of these journals to other countries, but most of the growth has been within the the English-speaking world. And I think that will change, I think, for reasons that have been articulated. But for the near future, that person in Nigeria, if they're going to be seriously listened to, are going to have to come through American or English-speaking journals, whether the top ones or whether the proliferation at the bottom of specialized field journals. That proliferation is enough to deal with without also having to deal with a Nigerian journal that nobody reads. So it is not a direction I would urge a young scholar to go, to find a very specialized journal outside of this system. They're going to have to come through this system with all its biases, or they're going to try to do the kind of thing that Tyler suggested, which, however, and this is where I would differ with it, requires them to have gone through this process to earn some credibility. I mean, who do I listen to on the blogosphere? Some name that I know. Where did I learn that name? They came through this system. So the only hope I see, Mary, is some change in the system. That's why I offered the suggestion of a prize instead of letting the people inside control the funding and pick the inputs, subsidize the inputs.
Maybe one comment.
Sure, please.
Just to complement what, sorry. I've been co-editor of the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization for over 10 years. And one striking aspect, I don't have the statistic, but is the increasing number of foreign researchers submitting and publishing. And I think that's also signaling a change.
Everybody is experienced.
I'm Yo Meijo. I'm from the World Bank in the policy world. So I just want to make perhaps as a consumer of research for policy purpose, if I may make a parallel to the medical world. When I was a patient seeking to choose a surgery methodology, I just happened upon Lancet, where they do meta-analysis and compare 3 alternatives, and just happily one dominates the other, and the other 2. So I happily chose that particular methodology. And at the time, I was wondering, I mean, in the policy world, we don't really have that kind of luxury. I don't get to see a lot of meta-analysis, which says, these are all the research in these areas, let's compare, and this one is superior in this particular context. Now, the policy questions are probably very, very complex, and therefore we don't really get to that type of sophistication. And whatever the Poverty Action Lab is doing is studying really micro, the kind of raindrop questions that Ken mentioned yesterday. So I wonder, I mean, on that particular front, what do you suggest for consumers actually do seek rigorous evidence for policy purpose? Then on the other hand, consumers actually don't really care. A lot of consumers, I think about the health, medical or / pseudo-medical kind of research, health products or herbal medicines, and there's huge market out there. People buy all kinds of dietary recommendations and health products, etc. They don't care who wrote rigorous evaluation about what, and they spend a lot of money on it. And I wonder whether that's somewhat parallel to the blog consumption, not of course Tyler type blog. I don't actually know the blog, but other people, that they don't really care about rigorous quality. They're taking bites for whatever personal satisfaction, and the certification process. Is there some rigor? So FDA must regulate certain sort of a life and death drugs, but other things are left outside the purview of FDA. Just some random thoughts and see whether there's any parallel we can bring into this conversation.
Well, can I start with I think that the demand for meta-analysis obviously is higher now because of this proliferation and specialization. There are mechanisms that did you say you were from the World Bank? You were. The World Bank at least did meta-analysis of stuff that it was interested in. I'm aware of a long project they had on the connection between health inputs and health outcomes. That's an old subject in economics as well as outside of economics. The difficulty of finding a connection between how much better people are as a function of how much more medical care they have. And the World Bank is obviously interested in that. And in my own research, I relied on their meta-analysis. So it does get done, and it gets done in your building. We have the Journal of Economic Literature, which is not really geared toward meta-analysis, but ends up doing that kind of thing by trying to summarize some of these vast proliferating literatures. I'm not aware of any quality control like that in the blogosphere, where somebody says, now look, there's 15 blogs on economics, this one is better than that one, and this is a synthesis of what these blogs say. Maybe there is, but I'm not as well aware of that. I think it goes on, bottom line, it goes on. It could go on more. I think it's a good point to bring it up.
Here's what I think journals miss when it comes to rigor. Most users, they want to see debate. And journals, as they're currently constructed, are not very good at having a kind of open and transparent debate online. So 3 referees liked a published article on real business cycle theory. But at the end of the day, unless you're really a specialist in that field, you don't have much of a sense. What do other economists actually think of that article? So a kind of checks and balances, open, immediate, here it is, Google right to it, I think is what most policy users want.
I have suggested that there be letters to the editor.
There should be much more. You could
much
have
more of that. I absolutely agree with you.
You're just raising the question whether the journals, as we now stand, the need for rapid. Well, wait a minute. Let me start again. What I distinguish between research and policy discussions. The journals are not the place for policy discussions. The blogs obviously serve a great function. I don't want to anyway denigrate them. They don't serve the function of doing research. They serve the function of bringing research results to bear on policy, and that's a different function. And the journals are not given the time lags, the time lags necessary to ensure certification. I don't see that they're the place for that kind of rapid-fire exchange. And so an alternative channel serves a great function.
I want to challenge the claim about quality. And in particular, I think we need to distinguish between the technical quality of the paper, which tends to actually be more conformist than it used to be, versus the quality of the paper as interpretation. We're very familiar with many papers. I know the joke we used to say in graduate school all the time was using star topologies on some obscure mathematics, and then there's 2 sentences at the end, and this explains why smoking is bad. And very often, journals will allow like a random comment or 2 through there in a very non-rigorous way, as long as the article itself is rigorous. And what my concern is that, take Mary's point about, say, Lagos or any small country. Often what it takes for an economist from a small country to get into a top journal is to do a very narrow technical thing, so that they come up with some estimator that improves at the margin the way in which certain types of econometrics are done. But that will be the only person in the country who can get into the AER. Because being able to publish in a top journal is certification. Some countries and many people will want the person who is the top economist. But of course, as we know, that doesn't match up well against the person making claims about the world and such and so forth. In the same way, Piketty's own work made it through major journals at technical levels, but many of the interpretations that Piketty has been making, in which he aggregates claims about his stuff, is not holding up to scrutiny in blogs, not at journal levels, but at blogs. And there's a kind of conflation of these kinds of issues. And I think it gets worse as the journals become signals of quality, but it's hard to separate out the technical quality of signal of the journal from the broad, if you like, generality, not simply policy, but the generality of the argument being made.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with anything you just said. I mean, the question is certification of the quality of what, right? And there is a problem in the profession today of the answer to the what being narrow, specialized stuff. That's important, but not to the exclusion of asking interesting questions or giving suggestive, if not closed, answers. I mean, I'm not going to go over all of that. I did that yesterday. There is a problem, but you know, I would want to second what Ken just said. There's a difference between the kind of feedback you're going to get on the blog and what the questions are that are motivating those people, and the certification of good research. Good research is not immediately policy relevant. It's not immediately amenable to criticism from the 30-second reflection on what was done in the blogosphere. There's a disconnect there that I think we have to keep in mind. The solution to your problem is not to shift attention to the blogosphere. It's to improve the evaluation process. And I threw out one suggestion. You're free to throw out others, but these problems are not going to be solved by coming up with some new way of distributing and evaluating knowledge, I think.
Thank you. My name is Hong Zhang. I'm from George Mason University. Is it on? Hey. Yes. My name is Hong Zhang. I'm from George Mason University. So I'm about to throw out a new alternative to both blogs and journals, which is the new social media for academics, such as academia.edu or researchgate.net, I think. So I wonder, any of you are using these things? Do you think there are good ways to reduce the transaction cost for the evaluation process of academic productions, intellectual articles? Thank you.
Here's what I find striking about journals. The American Economic Review, or any journal, They could, at zero cost, create a web page. It wouldn't have to give away their articles for free. It would just list the title of each article, and they could open up comments, free and open comments, and say, here, anyone can leave a comment on this article. And of course, a lot of those comments would be bad. Most of them would be bad. Some of them might be useful. The fact that this is not done, to me, is a sobering truth, a sobering reality. And it's an indication of how the incentives in the current system are not for debate and feedback. They're for a series of standalone statements which are robust to finding of error, but in terms of what it really means, we're still quite bad at processing that, and these alternative media have taken that over for better or worse. That, I think, is what the issue is, that journals themselves could have done much more and didn't, because they're not really set up to care so much about those issues. And it doesn't just have to be policy. I don't think policy versus non-policy is the key distinction. I think it's, if people care about the articles, there should be room for open public debate. We'll find a lot more errors in these articles.
That raises a very question which we seems not to have come up here so far. The emphasis has somehow been on economics. The issue you just raised now has nothing to do with economics. It should be equally true of biology or physics or anything else. That a journal, an article is published in physics, and maybe the question is, what does it really tell us? Maybe it sounds more important than it is, may sound. Maybe a hidden implication which makes it more important, or maybe, as you say, be wrong, not maybe in a technical sense, but that the implications aren't really what they seem to be. So what do we learn from? But on the whole, one thinks of the progress of physics and biology as being pretty impressive. What do we learn from the experiences of diffusion of information in other fields? They're facing most of the same problem. Economics is peculiarly policy-oriented. That's a difference. But let me leave that aside. I'm just curious. I haven't thought about the issue either.
Answer to both, but I think that one reason that the journals have not done what you suggest. Some have, by the way. There used to be a letter to the editor section of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and it's gone away. There was a wave of enthusiasm for replication in economics, which is a little bit of what you're talking about. It's feedback. I was editor of the Journal of Political Economy when we tried it. It failed. So there's a tension between just saying anybody, qualified or not, should be able to comment in the next 30 seconds on the title or the abstract or both. And the desire of the journal to keep some control over that process. And I think that the second one, that desire is going to trump the considerations that you mentioned that would suggest that we should have a more open debate about these issues. And it's going to be, to get a filtered process, which might be slower than 30 seconds, but not 2 years, to get a filtered process of comment from the profession is going to require even more resources and time from unpaid volunteers under the present system. And I just think that whole system is fraying about the edges unless you come up with some new way of rewarding that. So I think it's an input issue here. Unless you go to your suggestion, anybody can comment on anything, whether they're qualified to or not, which I would not recommend for the AER or similar journals.
I mean, you're suggesting, putting these suggestions together, you have a website, so the restriction on printing and all that, it disappears.
That's gone away already, Ken.
All right, okay.
Nobody reads the printed version.
Yeah, okay. But in but all right, So, but then you can have interchanges also on a very rapid scale. And you say you want to filter those. You don't want unfiltered
I think that the editors would be
filings.
reluctant to just say, we're going to have a website and anybody can come along. And, but they had a letters to the editors section in the Journal of Economics Perspectives, and that was filtered. That was edited and
I don't know.
It went away. Did you say somebody does it already? That's fine.
Yeah, the American economic journals have the possibility of basically, not everyone, but if you are subscribed to the journal, you can leave comments on the papers, and no one leaves comments. So that rises to another point, which is the concern that it exists for open discussion in the profession, given that that might affect your future publication prospect and things like that. So it's not clear that just opening will produce the outcome that is desired.
So I'm Jordan Adamson from Clemson University. Milton Friedman.
A little louder, please.
I'm Jordan Adamson.
Close to your mouth.
I'm Jordan Adamson. Milton Friedman once said in regards to medicine that certification is no guarantee for quality. So my question is, what is the most competitive market, and how do we get more competition?
Milton Friedman once said, certification is no guarantee of quality. So what is the most open market, and how can we get the most competition?
Well,
who would care to address that?
I think we've got a lot of competition for my journal space.
yeah,
And
I
it's
just
a free
think,
entry business.
because the knowledge and information is so unlike normal goods, like cars and shoes and so forth, where you can try these things out and tell what the quality is. I think the certification process is just incredibly important. And I know there's a tension between the requirement to certify what's done and delaying getting information out and so forth. I understand that, but I think certification is incredibly important, because the underlying credibility of the journal, of the discipline, of the researchers all hinge on the process. And so I don't see an easy way to get around that without really undermining the notion of quality and replicability. There are mistakes, and when mistakes are made, especially in the sciences, these things can have huge implications, in terms of drugs and so forth. In economics, mistakes can be made, and we want to limit that process, that possibility. So I'm a strong believer in the certification process.
Ken?
Go ahead. Alfred.
I'd like to get back to Mary's point, if I could, here. Ronald Coase has changed our view of the world by his looking at the micro details of the market allocation for the FCC radio spectrum. There is the counterpart that in the academic environment here with regard to this certification process. So it's not even that difficult to go to get into it. In the Chinese case, we looked at it there. They have simply documenting the formulas associated with the promotion process here and the implicit prices associated with getting an article published. And the consequences of that, the pressures for, you have co-authorship with the chair of the department, so on and so forth, is absolutely fascinating to the audience of economists, on the one hand, and it's also terribly important to understand how it's playing out. This is not going to solve the problems we're talking about here, but simply documenting the way in which the de facto price is associated with getting articles accepted and the implications of that and the implications of that about the nature of the incentives in these schools here. So we're wildly understudying the sort of microeconomics, and Claude, this is exactly the point Claude was making there, of our own environment here. And these distortions are particularly strong in many of the countries that we're working in. And it has profound implications for career tracks, for what people can actually do, and so forth here. And without resolving the whole issues here, for somebody in this room or somebody in our network to get them to dig into it and to do some comparative analysis would be very helpful. So about 3 years ago, a high school student in St. Louis came to me and said, I'd like to do some research. So I said, fine, why don't we talked about it. I said, why don't you look at where the top economists in the universities are here? So he ended up doing a 10-page paper on where the sources of the faculty at the top universities. It was a short paper. Tyler Cowen picked up on it, and it became the #1 article on SSRN for 2 months. There's, 65,000 people there. Why is that the case? Because he was looking just a bit at this phenomenon we're talking about here and doing something that was very straightforward. So I think there's some the gold on the floor to be picked up here, and I hope somebody can do it. Yes, Gary.
Well, I'm still trying to understand what the distortion is. I understand the distribution problem and so forth. But in terms of quality control and certification, I don't see that as a distortion. I see that as essential. I don't know if you create Country X's Journal of Economics and it doesn't have credibility, why that's an advantage for a researcher there or a young faculty member aspiring to publish and publishes in that journal. I just don't see the advantage. There isn't a public good provided effectively by having journals that have quality and getting into them. It's hard to do, but I just don't see what the distortion is.
Well, let me be specific here. If you look at the formula, some of you would know better than I do, de facto in the Chinese universities, they have a formula with regard to promotions there, and the issue is what weights do they put on the various journals here. So you may get 10 points for publishing the American Economic Review and 0.5 points for getting in some other things. I don't have a full answer. I'm simply saying documenting this and understanding how these formulas work out in practice is very important. It's just like Yang Yao was talking, that the heart of the incentive system in the Chinese hierarchy you have to look at the incentives about the promotion there.
I was struck by this idea of a formula. There's what happens to judgment in these matters, which I think was something that Coase would want to see. I remember we once promoted my department a member of the faculty promoted to tenure. Member of the faculty didn't have a PhD. There were various reasons why I didn't have a PhD. There was a story behind that, as you can imagine. He'd been written quite a few papers, and there's that. And I must say, even the dean said, "Well, you made a case. You made a good case for this exception." Well, the point is, if you had some rule, which you would ordinarily expect today to be even an assistant professor, you have to have a PhD. I was appointed assistant professor without one, so you put in these mechanical rules. Right. I would say you're going to create a lot of problems because there's always rooms for things. It's the point about communication in general that you can't. And this is a point that Coase made about the theory of the firm, that you need you have to have discretion somewhere in the system because there's no you can't provide in advance for all the rules. And publishing the AER as a criterion for a tenure at Fudan does not strike me as being a reasonable kind of rule.
We shall quote you on that.
You may.
At George Mason University. Two comments about topics that are related that haven't been discussed. One, I'm on the Tenure and Promotion Committee for two departments. I'm on the Tenure and Promotion Committee for two departments in my university, and we look at age factors quite a bit. We look at impact factors that are measured in terms of how many times an individual has been cited. Usually that has to do with the peer review process. It's very, and that's become paramount, and you have to explain why somebody who doesn't have a high impact factor might have actually produced quality reports, and a lot of the letters now actually speak to this factor. So that's one issue that I wonder how it fits into the discussion. But the second is, I think in this conversation so far, the distinction between policy world and the politician's world hasn't been clearly established. I teach in a policy school, and our objective is to train people who deal with really difficult issues in government, such as in the health sector, such as in the transportation sector. They need rigorous analytical capabilities that are not necessarily available through economics departments, and they have a lot to do with the public policy world. Politicians' world, I see that more in the blog world. They may respond to this, they may read this, but the serious work of policy making today is highly technocratic, and it has all of the issues of proof and evidence that a peer-reviewed process require, and I don't see that as being transferred to the world of blogs.
I've perhaps come here to get absolution. I'm a practitioner laterally turned to what was described as a research fellow, and until I attended this conference, I thought that research fellow, as I was designated at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, was to give me a fancy name because they couldn't think of anything else to designate me as. But having been at this conference, I realized that I've been a Coasean research fellow all along. And I wonder if I'm being a bit iconoclastic when I say that the certification process has never applied to me. What I have done in any papers that I've published, and they have been quite a few, is I've done my work in the field, given advice, appraised a project, changed some institutional practices or whatever, and then I've said, hey, this could be of more general use. I think I'll convert this to a paper. So I turned it from specific into a neutral kind of thing, and there's a paper. Nobody certifies it because there's nobody really who's well enough informed to be able to know what it is I've really tried to do. But it makes me wonder if, like I think it's the somebody who said you can end up teaching to the certification or teaching to the test rather than providing information for general view. And it may be that the Coasean approach is telling us don't necessarily teach for the certification process, don't teach to meet some kind of incestuous standard among academia, but teach or write papers in order that people outside in the big world, especially the developing world, may be better informed and better do their work.
Anyone wish to respond on that?
One of the things we're trying to do in the Coase Institute is to figure out a way to lower the transaction cost where practitioners can work with scholars, and you can get that arbitrage there. It's not easy.
Next question.
the audience.
Henry Hetker, researcher at NARA. I wondered what your feelings are on the trade deficit. Years ago, my brother, 20 years ago, wrote Wall Street Week, Kaiser, and they responded, there's no real concern over this issue. It simply spurs the economy. That was their response. They had plenty of economists that they knew that could, give them indications on how to respond. Currently, we have a trade deficit substantially larger, but of course, we sell a lot of products overseas. The other point is the price of oil has come down recently. And according to CBS News, we are saving the equivalent of $450 million a day in our pockets, which we can spend on other goods. Now, that being the case, what are your suggestions for the future? Have economists evaluated this problem recently and have further indications on, through their research, what should be done as far as commanding our economy here and putting it in a better position if we need to?
Maybe I can address that. I don't worry about trade deficits per se in the American context, especially since the dollar is a reserve currency. I do view our current trade deficit as a kind of reminder or message or signal that our rate of time preference is too high. And in particular, I'm concerned at the distribution of our national savings rate across businesses and households. So the household rate has been running at 4% now, it's just barely above 5%. And our national savings rate is about 20%, which is okay. But so much of it is done for businesses. And if you think about what that means, say, for wealth inequality or retirement behavior looking forward, I think that's a concern. But it's not the trade deficit at all, which bugs me. But there may be different opinions on the panel.
Oh, God. I have enough trouble with regulation and industrial organizations taking on the trade deficit.
Put it another way, though, it's not entirely the savings rate, it's the fact that the dollar-denominated securities are a good place for other people to invest.
Sure, of course, and that's a mixed blessing. Thank you, Mary. Thank you all for your questions. Thank the panelists.